My name's Karen Charman. I'm the managing editor of Capitalism, Nature's Socialism, which is the sponsor of this, one of 4 panels that we're sponsoring. And what we're going to talk about today is nuclear power and why nuclear power is not a good idea. So anyway, there are 4 of us, as you can see on the panel. I'm going to let each of our speakers introduce themselves, and then we will go through and do our presentations, and then we'll take questions and have a discussion afterwards. Yeah? Okay. So first up is Arnie Gunderson.
Yeah, my name is Arnie Gunderson. I put my email up there. If anybody had questions, you can send me an email. And I also made about 20 hard copies of the presentation, so I'll pass them out. Real briefly, I'm going to talk about nuclear power, especially new nukes, and but some of it is old nuke as well. I have a bachelor's and master's in nuclear, I have a reactor operator's license, and I was a senior VP in a nuclear company. And there was a point in my life when I read the Wall Street Journal and actually believed it. And in 1990, I found some violations. That my company was a licensee, and I told the president. He fired me. I became a whistleblower, and there was congressional hearings, and it was NES, Nuclear Energy Services. It was I personally been in about 70 reactors worldwide, including in Europe. But anyway, my family and I were sued for $1.5 million because I kept talking about the violations. And a key nuclear lawyer said to me once, "Arnie, in this business, either you're for us or you're against us, and you just crossed the line." So since that time, I've provided expert witness testimony for people who have been intervening against nuclear licensees, and I've also been a school teacher as well. So anyway, let's get on to the topic at hand. First off, there's nuclear power plants traditionally in a period of less than 10 years. They went from around 500 megawatts to 1,300 megawatts. Before the 500-600 megawatt power plants were built, they were already building 800s. And before the 800s were completed, they were already building 1100s. And now we've got 100 nuclear reactors, some of which, well, the first one just turned 40 this week. And there's a couple more in the pipeline. So, and the newest ones have been operating for roughly 20 years. And those are 1,100 to 1,300 megawatts. The new generation reactors, there are no small ones. There are 1,000 to as much as 1,600 megawatts. And they're essentially a brand new design. But they're large. And so the first point is these new reactors are very, very large. And nuclear reactors, there's a thing called Carnot efficiency. Nuclear reactors are inherently less efficient than coal plants. Coal plants run at much higher temperatures than nuclear reactors, so the thermodynamic efficiency is much less for a nuclear reactor. So what that means is that they pump out, a nuclear plant pumps out per megawatt about 30% more heat than a coal plant, sometimes even 40% more heat than a coal plant. So you've got a very large plant with an enormous amount more heat being pumped out. So the first problem in the case against centralized nuclear power plants is the heat they generate. We're actually in a situation where it's not a matter of nuclear power plants making the world safe from global warming. We really need to eliminate global warming to make the world safe for nuclear power plants. Because there's so much heat being pumped out into the rivers. And we've already had the example twice. In France 2 years ago, they had that heat wave. What did they shut down? They shut down the nukes. It wasn't that then the coal plants and the oil plants kept going because they produced per megawatt less heat, less burden on the rivers. And the same thing down in the south, the drought we had. It was the nukes that were threatened because the consumption of water in a nuclear plant compared to a coal or an oil is astronomical. So these things swallow an awful lot of water, and yet the industry, even on these new nukes, is not considering across the board. Some plants they will, but cooling towers. The solution to it is to go cooling towers on every plant, but of course that raises the price. So first off, nukes will not prevent global warming, and in fact will be a victim to global warming. Just when you need them the most, summer heat spells, is when you'll have them the least, because you'll have to reduce power. That's an interesting warm-up to some of the more important issues. I'm sure if you're here, you're aware of the nuclear waste issues, and they haven't gone away, and in fact they're going to be magnified as a result of these nukes. Obama has cut back. I really can't say shut down completely, but the nuclear waste dump out at Yucca Mountain is maybe mothballed. It's a good word. I wouldn't doubt it. May still rise from the ashes at some point, but it's dead for all practical purposes. But there's no viable technology for the nuclear waste we have, and you know, when you're digging a hole, you know, you want to stop going down. The best thing to do is to stop digging, and here we are churning out more waste. But even if there's a viable technology, which has yet to be demonstrated, the problem is that the material hangs around for 1,000,000 years. So plutonium is the longest lived half-life, and it hangs around for 1,000,000 years. And it always fascinates me, the ego of scientists. We have maybe 20 years of studies where you'll put a material and watch it migrate. And based on 20 years of studies, we're making 1,000,000-year projections. It's absolutely fascinating. As far as I can't understand how, as a society, we can make a judgment 1,000,000 years in the future based on the information that's available to us. I've heard it at a couple of discussions. Where are these dumps located? The low-level dump, the most recently approved low-level dump, is in a low-income portion of Texas. Most of the low-level dumps around the country are in low-income areas. And it isn't because they just happen to be on the most preferable geology. It's because they just can't afford to oppose it. Back when I was on the other side of the argument, and I was one of a few people responsible for siting a nuclear dump in Connecticut. And when I lived in Connecticut, and we had oh yeah, and so we had meetings, and nobody came, and we had meetings and nobody came, we had meetings and nobody came, and then we announced the 4 locations. One was in Sharon, and if anybody knows Sharon, Connecticut, it's a weekend community, enormous wealth. And that was actually the best geology in the state, was up in Sharon. And within a day, the residents of Sharon had $100,000 in donations to stop us. And the other 3 were along the Connecticut River in Enfield, and it happened that the head of the Connecticut Senate lived in that district. So geology doesn't necessarily match with what the best choice is not necessarily where you're going to wind up with it, as we see. You know, it gets forced down onto into lower income areas. My guess is that this stuff's going to get shipped to a third world country. The solution to it will be to send it to, I don't know, the Sahara Desert or something like that. So essentially we'll export that pollution offshore. And that's just a guess, but I believe that that's where the resistance to nuclear within the states is so significant. Whenever they'll pick a state, it will be held for years, and the solution will be to send it overseas. And is that fair? You know, we're using the power, and we're shipping our 1,000,000-year problem to the Sudan, or I hope not the Sudan, but wherever. Whenever I talk about nuclear, everybody says, "Well, aren't the French succeeding? And can we use the French experience on nuclear?" The French have something going for them. One, they have one design, 3 variations on one design, so that from the operations standpoint, there's if it screws up on one plant, they can fix it across the board in all their reactors. That's a positive. But and the United States has dozens of different designs because it was all set up with individual utilities doing their own thing, and it was coming out of the rate base anyway, so everybody basically customized it. So we don't have, if one person makes a mistake, that knowledge isn't not necessarily transferable. But the real issue in the French experience is that there seems to be this myth that the French have eliminated the problem of nuclear waste. In fact, they haven't. What they've done is there's no nuclear waste at the French reactors. They ship it all to the reprocessing plant, but it's sitting at those reprocessing plants. So yeah, they've moved it, but they haven't solved it.
It's one more sentence you didn't say.
What's that?
They keep it moving. One of the places they're going to move it to, and there's paperwork with NRDC to move it into the port of Charleston, process it. The Italians have already applied for this, the Italian industry. Move it to Tennessee for processing, and then put it into Idaho. That's in the works. So we are a potential receiver of foreign nuclear waste. The paperwork is already out there. The lobbyists are hard at it.
That's the low-level waste is going that way. The plutonium, yeah.
You're an expert. I'm not going to go into what level of it is. But the other next track, the next buy of the United States companies, because they're owned by companies, is the Romanian waste. And that's in the works because it's going to be shipped to Italy for storage, and then the Italians will assume property rights of the waste, and then it will be Italian waste. So it doesn't have to follow the EU rules, it'll follow the American rules, which are, we buy everything, we process it, and...
I think we should,
okay.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
I have some updates for you.
You got the major points.
So the European, the French experience has there's a lot of contamination all the way up to Greenland. They're picking up contamination from the fuel reprocessing facility. So it's not as lily white, and they still don't have it in the ground in some kind of 1,000-year or million-year storage system. So, but the English experience is just the same. The English spend over $1 billion on a reprocessing plant, and they're thinking about throwing in the towel. Just in the last 2 weeks, there were some newspaper articles about the English experience on that, and that's the Irish Sea, and the Irish Sea is contaminated now. So it's interesting. There's one of my references at the back of this is a guy named Dr. Chris Busby, who's done some phenomenal epidemiological work to talk about the health effects of the reprocessing, both at the British and the French experience. Getting back to new nukes. It's not just a matter of building a power plant. Make no mistake, these new nukes are part of a scheme called closing the fuel cycle, which has been a dream of nuclear power for years and years and years. And what that means is that the plants we have now were essentially what's called a burner. You put uranium in, you burned it for 3 years, you took it out, and you sent it to a long-term storage, and that was that. These plants these new plants are going to be built for something called MOX, mixed oxide fuel, and that means plutonium. These plants will be designed to burn plutonium. A couple of the US reactors now can burn it, but these plants are designed to burn plutonium. Now, what that means is that the new fuel coming into the plant has plutonium in it. Historically, the old fuel leaving the plant, if it ever did leave the plant, would have plutonium in it. But that fuel was so contaminated, it would be very difficult for a terrorist to disassemble it and use that plutonium for a bomb. But now you've got fuel coming in, new fuel coming in that's clean, and chemically it's easy to separate out plutonium from uranium. So that now becomes a major terrorist target. And remember, only 10 pounds of plutonium makes a bomb. So you have several bomb loads of plutonium coming into the plant. So it's a serious terrorism issue that we're creating. The other thing is, even if you don't make a bomb, plutonium itself is carcinogenic. And a dollar bill is a gram, roughly. If you break that dollar bill into 1 million pieces, 1 microgram will kill you if it's plutonium. And these things are churning out 500 pounds a year of plutonium. So it's, you're creating a lethal material that hangs around for 1 million years, and a microgram of it is lethal. Part of this closing the fuel cycle also, though, ties into the industry's talking about fast burners, which are sodium-cooled reactors, liquid sodium. Liquid sodium burns in air and can't be put out with water. So if you have a leak, you got some pretty serious problems. Fermi-1, a reactor that had a meltdown near Detroit, was a sodium reactor. But this is all part of reprocessing mixed oxide fuel, fast burners, and part of a much broader strategy.
Are those breeder reactors?
No, they're fast burners. The breeders also are sodium cooled, and there's just a little difference, but they're just as nasty. Yeah, yeah. These plants will be like the old plants, subject to terrorism. One, just to hit a nuclear plant, psychologically, it's not something one would want. But on top of that, you still have all of the old terrorism issues that haven't been solved in the new design, and in fact are probably even worse. The NRC has something, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has something called a threat matrix, and they assume that 6 people show up at the gate and try to break in. That's the threat matrix. But they assume that the weapons they have don't include rocket-propelled grenades, that they don't include 50 caliber rifles, that they don't include some things that I can buy on the internet for about $3,000. So the threat matrix that the NRC uses when they attack a power plant in their simulations really is incredibly myopic. And in fact, probably for about $100 grand and 3 dedicated people, you could take one of these out. And the other issue is flying. These plants, as well as their older plants, are not airplane resistant. Real quick story on Indian Point, right up the river here. The NRC was trying to make the argument that the plant was resistant to an attack by an airplane. And they were just ready to release the report when Union Concerned Scientists got a hold of the backup data. And what happened is the NRC crashed the plane into the parking lot, skidded it across the lawn through the fence, and bumped it up against the plant after it stopped. And that was the basis that they were going to declare that the plant was airplane resistant. In fact, they are not. 1 is the impact, and 2 is the fire. And I don't have to tell you guys about. The new nukes, as Karen will talk about, a lot of the information that they're designing new nukes to came out of 3-Mile Island. And the industry's learned the wrong lessons from 3-Mile Island, and the amount of radiation that they're releasing are much less than should be. But the net effect is that you've got a plant with 5 times more radiation than 3-Mile Island, the new plants versus the old. And yet the industry has been lobbying for smaller evacuation zones based on the 3-Mile Island experience. They've also dropped the safety margins. Instead of having pipes break, what's called a double-ended guillotine break, where they would split like that and spew their contents, they have them called weep before break. So they start to leak, and you have a chance to shut the reactor down. But the net effect of that is that your containment is less strong than it is in a modern design. So the new designs, to keep the cost down, the cost is already astronomical, but to keep the cost down, they've cut down on the safety margins for these new reactors. One last thing, they're using something called risk-based probability assessments, and the books are cooked. It's like if you play cards, what are the odds of getting 3 in a row or something like that? Well, it's a probability game, but the data that they're using is the most favorable data, so that they can justify systems that are nowhere near as rigid. Yeah.
In terms of the example you just gave of how they're, the accident scenarios that they're using for pipe breaks are less severe. Are all of the new reactor designs that are getting approved, getting reviewed right now? Do they all, subscribe to those lighter standards? Yes. They're all based on
Yes. They're all based on that leak before break, as opposed to double-ended guillotines and things like that. Yeah, yeah. And the process has become that a lot of the redundancy that is built into the older plants there's actually less redundancy and less parts that are moving. Yeah.
Actually, we should do the question.
Oh, okay.
Then I'll shoot through. The last thing, and here I am at left forum, and I'll tell you the way to shut a nuke down is to be a capitalist. The price of these things is so astronomical that Wall Street won't buy them. And if we can stop the federal subsidies, you can stop the new nukes. The way to stop this process is to think like a capitalist. A new nuke costs about $9,000 a kilowatt. So if I had a little generator here that was a kilowatt, a new nuke is about $9,000. A windmill is about $2,000. So that 4 windmills roughly equals 1 new nuke. Wind blows about a quarter of the time. So 4 windmills equals 1 nuke as far as power output goes. And yet there's none of the other issues about sabotage or about waste disposal and things like that. Warren Buffett evaluated going into the new nuke business, and he said, I can't figure out how to make money. Now, if Warren Buffett can't figure out how to make money, it's time to fold up the deck. Yeah. No, I'm not worried about baseload. I think yeah, they always talk about that.
I'll talk about that.
Okay, you'll talk about that. Okay, we'll talk about that.
What was the cost ratio there? It's
$9,000 a kilowatt, it's in there, versus $2,000 a kilowatt roughly. And I'm not advocating that wind is the solution, but when you compare it to other things that are available, it's certainly way at the extreme of the mix. It's almost as if we're building a Maginot Line. You know, it's all these fixed pieces of hardware as opposed to being able to more closely match the load. We're building a plant 15 years in advance, and when it turns on all at once, there's a big spike in the ability to generate. Whereas if you build windmills, you can build them 100 at a time and stay closer to the load growth. You know, it seems to be much a reactive way as opposed to a predictive way of doing it. I think that's it. And I will move on to your next.
All right.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Pass the mic.
Oh, pass the mic.
Oh, no, I did. I thought we did. Okay. Oh, gosh. Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Dave, can you hear? Yeah? Okay. Can you all hear me? Yes? Yes. Okay. I'm going to talk about 3-Mile Island because we just passed the 30th anniversary of it. And there's a tremendous amount of misinformation about what actually happened there. So that's the subject of my talk. Actually, it was 3 weeks ago today, on March 28th, that we passed the 30th anniversary of 3-Mile Island, this country's worst commercial nuclear power plant accident. The common assumption, repeated ad nauseum by the nuclear industry, the government, the mainstream media, and now taken for the truth, is that nobody died. That conclusion is based on the supposed and again incessantly repeated fact that not enough radiation escaped from the boundaries of the plant. Therefore, the argument goes, nobody outside the plant boundaries could have died, nor been injured as a result of radiation exposure from the accident. The biggest casualty of 3-Mile Island, we're told, is the nuclear industry itself. This interpretation is an important part of a larger narrative that is being used to justify putting nuclear power back on the table as a necessary and valued energy source in an age of looming catastrophic climate change. The problem is the claim that nobody died nor was injured as a result of this accident because very little radiation escaped. And they say on average no more than about a chest x-ray's worth is what people were exposed to. The problem with that is that it's an out-and-out lie. Why do I say that? First, hundreds of people who lived near 3-Mile Island reported various symptoms of acute radiation poisoning on the day of the accident. This included symptoms like a metallic taste in the mouth, instant sunburn on the skin, you know, that was not covered up by clothing, vomiting, nausea, blistering in the nose, blistering on the lips. These are all symptoms of acute radiation poisoning that have been reported by downwinders of radiation exposure and bomb blasts. And there are also some very eye-opening magazine articles that were written a few years after the accident, talking about what actually happened to the people there. So there are accounts, media accounts. It's just that they're old and buried and forgotten now. And there are also numerous affidavits from various residents who lived near the plant, describing the health problems, describing what happened to them on the day, the health problems that they experienced, the many kinds of bizarre cancers and illnesses and things like that. This all despite their strong suspicion, that these health problems resulted from the accident. Not only were they unable to get any help in seriously investigating any of these problems, but they encountered incredible resistance to the very idea of it, that their health problems could have resulted, from the accident. The second thing is that radiation monitoring was completely inadequate at the time of the accident. Some of the monitors on the stacks, the ones that were located in the right place to actually be able to measure radiation, they actually went off scale, and I was told they melted, but you said that what? They saturated. In other words, there was so much radiation that they just, they couldn't record anymore. Beyond that, there were nowhere near enough dosimeters actually out in the community to be able to accurately measure what was coming down in the radiation plumes. And Arnie, actually, recently, has done some new calculations on radiation releases from 3-Mile Island, and you said, what, 100 to 1,000 times more radiation than has been acknowledged is what was likely released. And the thing is that we never will know for sure because, it's gone. The information's gone. They didn't want to know. In looking back over the various news accounts, which I've done the last couple of weeks about this, what became really clear to me was a really disturbing and, quite frankly, shocking picture that emerges of government neglect of the victims and the public at large in order to protect an industry that is supremely privileged, the nuclear industry. The story of the 3-Mile Island accident, it's so complex. I mean, to me, it kind of mirrors the daunting complexity of a nuclear power plant itself. With all its miles of pipes and its gazillions of gauges and valves and highly specialized equipment that you don't find in other applications. It serves as a sort of metaphor to me, for the dauntingly complex twists and turns that the citizens who were victimized by the radiation exposures, from this accident, that they had to go through in dealing with the aftermath of the accident. And in trying to protect themselves from future, or I guess current, at the time, releases as they were cleaning up the plant. So I want to talk a little bit about just some of the main things that came out in this, and also mention the main players in this saga to sort of lay out who's involved here. So we've got the operator of 3-Mile Island, Metropolitan Edison, its parent company, General Public Utilities, and we've got the insurance carriers. We've got local residents, their advocates and expert witnesses, state and local government officials, federal government agencies, particularly the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and we've got the courts. On February 17th, 1979, this is about 6 weeks before the 3-Mile Island accident, 3-Mile Island Unit 1, there are 2 reactors there. One had been in operation for about 5 years, and it shut down for a routine refueling at that time. And that refueling outage was expected to take place for a few months. On March 28th, 1979, a water leak into an airline, not an airplane, an airline in the plant, causes 2 pumps in the secondary feed water system to shut down, which triggers a whole cascade of events that control room operators misread and continued to misread for several hours, which exacerbated the problem hugely. The upshot was that water was drained from the reactor core, which overheated and then began to melt. And approximately 70% of the fuel melted in the reactor, and there were significant releases of radiation into the environment over various times during the following 3 days or so. Yeah. Widespread reports say that by the time the workers at the plant had gotten control of the accident, it was approximately 30 minutes before there would have been a complete meltdown of the core. If TMI-2, by the way, had been in commercial operation, it was a new plant, only 3 months at the time of the accident. And I think it was even 3 months to the day, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was 3 full power months.
Right. Okay. Now, the accident started at 4 in the morning, but news of it didn't reach the community for a while, and most people had no idea of what was happening, especially that first day. The day of the accident was a Wednesday. It was the first warm day of spring that year. So you had, the locals with less layers of clothing. They just went about their business. School kids were out in the morning waiting for their school buses. They were out on the playgrounds during the day, at recess time, at lunchtime, out afterwards. Reports later surfaced that Metropolitan Edison downplayed and concealed what they knew at the time about radiation releases. I mean, it is true, there was a lot of confusion going on, but also that they downplayed. And that they withheld information from local, state, and federal officials. Had the information been known, Pennsylvania Governor Richard Thornburg later said that he would have ordered an immediate evacuation, which would have prevented the worst radiation exposures to the population there. Finally, on Friday, now it's also true that people were, there was talk about evacuation, and he was pretty resistant to that idea, because I think there was that whole idea about wanting to keep calm, whatever. Finally, on Friday, 2 days afterwards, at 12:30 at our press conference, he suggested that pregnant women and children leave the area. And, of course, you can imagine the panic and all that. About 2.5 months after the accident, officials from General Public Utilities told the NRC they thought that Unit 1 would be able to go back into operation on September 1st. 11 days later, Governor Thornburg objected to a restart of TMI Unit 1 until serious issues were resolved. GPU responded by saying that restarting TMI 1 would save local electricity customers $6 a month on their bills. But the following week, the NRC ordered the company to keep Unit 1 shut down until it could provide reasonable assurance that the reactor could be operated safely. The company was very anxious to get the reactor back in operation because it estimated that with 1 destroyed reactor and 1 shut reactor at 3-Mile Island, they were losing about $500,000 a day in revenue. As time went on, they were looking for any way to decrease their economic losses, and who knows, maybe even make a little money on the deal. GPU sued the NRC for $4 billion in damages, saying that the agency was negligent and therefore liable because the NRC had failed to notify the utility about a similar incident that triggered this accident that had taken place at the Davis-Besse reactor in Ohio the year before. But the difference is that at Davis-Besse, they were actually able to recognize the problem and stop it before it became a catastrophe. And it also was revealed that at TMI Unit 2, before it was in commercial operation, the year before, it had a similar incident, and they didn't even read their own, you know, their own logbooks, so they couldn't really rely on that. GPU also sued Babcock and Wilcox, which is the manufacturer of the reactor, for the same, you know, on the same grounds, basically saying that you manufactured this dog of a plant that had these problems. You knew it was a problem with what happened at Davis-Besse. You refused to issue a
change order.
Yeah, you know, a change order notification. You know, and that was true, but still, you know, and this horrible lawsuit ensued, and all kinds of things came out. But anyway, that ended up, you know, they didn't end up getting their $4 billion. Throughout the entire saga, though, GPU maintained its stance as an aggrieved company that had a little problem, this accident that was costing much more than it should have. But aside from seeking whatever help the company needed in terms of dealing with its problem, it really should be able to resume business as usual. That was the attitude that they had. Meanwhile, the citizens in this largely conservative region quickly moved to the bottom of the list of priorities in terms of dealing with the crisis. And I think the typical paternalistic impulse among government officials, in most cases, to try to avoid panic, played into this. But there's also been a demonstrated effort to not really investigate the impact of the accident and then deny that real physical harm from it that continues strong as ever today actually occurred. So after being stonewalled in their requests for help, local citizens had to take it upon themselves to go door to door to collect the data on health surveys among people who were there to try and find out, you know, what actually happened to the people. They figured out, based on wind and weather patterns in the first days of the accident, where the radiation plumes had been. That's how they charted where they were going. The government and scientific establishment, instead of acknowledging the value of their sophisticated sleuthing, dismissed their more detailed analysis of where the radiation plumes were and attacked their results as scientific. Even though the health survey that they used was designed with the help of a health official who documented radiation injuries in Colorado out by the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant. I'll skip that part. Instead, the studies sanctioned by officialdom were mainly statistical analyses that didn't cover nor try to track all of the actual people who were there at the time of the accident. There were complaints that none of the officially accepted studies followed up to see what happened to people who moved out of the area after the accident, and that they included newcomers who weren't there during the accident, thus diluting the results. Furthermore, scientists who tried to help get a real analysis of what happened there were either ignored or viciously attacked as incompetent anti-nuclear ideologues. The New York Times, for instance, referred to them as nuclear fabulists. One important study of the health effects of the accident came about through a public health fund that was set up as part of the terms of a 1981 settlement of a class action lawsuit on behalf of citizens. And this particular study was ordered by a federal district court judge in Harrisburg in 1986 and published in 1990 by a team of epidemiologists, mainly from Columbia University. And note these time frames here. I mean, the accident happened in 1979, you know, and here we don't see a study out until 1990. Interestingly, the judge actually issued an order that the researchers only consider the most likely estimates of radiation releases from the accident and not consider upper limit or worst case estimates of releases of radioactivity or population doses. The researchers were ordered to report their results to attorneys representing insurance carriers that were responsible for paying claims related to the accident. And if they had any problems with the study, they had to work out a resolution with the nuclear insurers. So somehow that doesn't seem to me like an unfettered search for the truth. In any case, the Columbia study did not find a clear increase in cancer cases that the researchers felt could be attributed to 3-Mile Island. Meanwhile, the number of people getting sick with a wide range of illnesses and cancers continued to grow. Many tried to get some compensation through legal claims against the nuclear company. In February 1985, 6 years after the accident, several out-of-court settlements were announced. And according to news reports, the insurers said that these settlements were purely to avoid more expensive litigation and did not constitute an admission of guilt or liability. Furthermore, a condition of settling was that the claimants were forbidden to reveal the terms of the settlements. So secrecy plays a big part in this whole saga. And only settlements involving minors and the handful of people who had already died were even reported, because cases involving children or dead people legally had to be part of the public record. The biggest known settlement was for actually it was $1.1 million for a baby born with Down syndrome after the accident, and there was also an $855,000 settlement for a little girl who was born with cerebral palsy. But most of the kids, and I think there were 70 of them, they got about $10,000 each. By March '85, it was reported that 3-Mile Island's insurers had paid out a total of $40 million in damage claims. This included $20 million for economic losses and $5 million for the Public Health Fund, which were both announced as settlement for the class action lawsuit in 1981. Approximately $500,000 to reimburse state and local governments for emergency response costs at the time of the accident, and even that took a legal battle to get, and $14.5 million in personal injury claims, again, which were paid after a lengthy court battle. One point that I think is really important in this is that since this was a nuclear accident, it triggered the Price-Anderson Act, which is a law on the books since 1957. And Price-Anderson is the statute that extends insurance protection for a nuclear accident to the public, but it also limits the nuclear utility's liability to an amount that is contained in a pool of money that each nuclear reactor operator pays into. The size of the pool is determined by the number of operating reactors in the country, and currently is supposed to be about $10 billion or so. Many people contend that without Price-Anderson, the nuclear power industry would not exist, because no private insurer would cover the liability for a nuclear accident. And indeed, the current $10 billion that's supposed to be there, and there over time, not all at once either, like over 6 years after an accident by the time bits of it are paid out per year. There's criticism that that's woefully inadequate if, for example, an accident on the scale of Chernobyl happened at, say, Indian Point. Chernobyl cost an estimated $350 billion.
In a rural area?
Yes, in a rural area. Here, estimates are if there was that kind of accident at Indian Point, the cost would be in the trillions. But that aside, what became clear to me as I was reading through the various news accounts is that even though Price-Anderson was triggered, which at the time of the TMI accident meant that there was supposed to be $560 million available to deal with, it wasn't like people could just make their claim and get, whatever they needed. They had to spend years fighting traumatic legal battles, and in fact the courts eventually, in 1996, 17 years after the accident, dismissed a class action lawsuit with claims by 2,000 people, many of whom had already died waiting for their cases to be heard. The judge, who's the same one who ordered that Columbia University epidemiology study, oh, right. She said in her ruling that the plaintiffs had failed to prove their case, but that was after she disallowed, 8 of 10 of their expert witnesses? So, I mean, of course. Including one of the witnesses who actually re-examined the data from the Columbia study and came to a very different conclusion, and that was Steve Wing, about cancers and other illnesses that resulted. Instead, we're told that that the cancers and other illnesses that people did develop, I mean, they acknowledged that people got sick, just not that it was because of the radiation from the accident. They say that it resulted from the stress. They really say that. And they're even starting to say it about Chernobyl victims too. True, they are. Or their own bad habits like smoking, drinking, taking too much anti-anxiety medicine. I mean, they were talking about problems with births and things like that as pregnancy problems because of the anti-anxiety medicine. In other words, anything but radiation exposure from the accident. Now, aside from the offensiveness of that contention, the issue of stress actually has its own featured role in the 3 Mile Island legal drama. After the accident, the traumatized community strongly opposed Unit 1 to start up, and part of their challenge to prevent the reactor from operating again was the claim that restarting the reactor was causing enormous psychological stress to the community. The NRC did not want to have to consider the psychological impact on the community in its decision on whether to allow Unit 1 to resume operation, but federal courts ordered them to do so. And there were even some court-ordered psychological assessments of how community residents were coping, but those studies didn't actually help the community. And in the long legal battle that ensued over trying to keep Unit 1 shut down, all sorts of bizarre, frightening, and very stress-inducing facts emerged. This, of course, added to their anxiety. Of the citizens who were repeatedly shown just how little power they had, not only to get the recognition and compensation for the harm inflicted on them, but to try to prevent continuing harm to them. One thing that came out was that more than 31,000 steam generator tubes in Unit 1, this was the reactor that they were wanting to restart, were damaged. So GPU, the company, decided to fix them by using a new procedure that had never been used in nuclear steam generator repairs. The public, naturally suspicious and wary about any potential safety problem, was concerned about whether this would be adequate. The NRC approved this and said the issue shouldn't prevent the reactor from restarting. It also came out that leak rate surveillance tests on both Unit 1 and 2 had been systematically manipulated, and results were falsified over several months before the accident, and that the supervisors were well aware of this. In fact, Met-Ed, the utility that operated 3 Mile Island, eventually pleaded guilty to one felony count in a criminal case brought by the Department of Justice. And there's a whole really disgusting saga behind that, which we can talk about, but I'm not going to go into right at this particular minute. GPU also admitted that its staff cheated on their relicensing exams. One control operator was even charged and convicted, actually by the same judge, this Judge Rambo, who ended up dismissing the class action lawsuit. The local community, 2 NRC commissioners, the Pennsylvania governor, both of its senators, some of them, they all argued, some of them quite passionately, against allowing the restart of Unit 1. But ultimately, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the courts, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, disregarded their wishes, and on October 8th, 1985, TMI Unit 1 was reconnected to the electrical grid. People continued to be harmed and died from injuries and diseases triggered not only by the initial radiation releases from the accident, but also from subsequent and often deliberate radiation releases that occurred throughout the cleanup of the destroyed reactor. Now, the reason that I think that this is so important, that people really understand what happened with 3 Mile Island, is God help us if it happens again. And really, aside from feeling the outrage at the terrible injustice and the horrible harm to the innocent people in central Pennsylvania, that's the whole point. Right now, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is handing out 20-year license extensions and permits to run nuclear reactors in the existing aging fleet. They're handing out these upright things to allow them to run much harder than they were designed to be, and longer than they were designed to be. So to me, 3 Mile Island serves as a very
No nukes, no coal, no kidding, and the other one, nuclear dragons to be slain. And I really encourage you to not only take these, but pass them on, because there's a lot happening, it's happening fast, and my talk isn't going to go into all of it. So that's just life. Oh, but before I sit down, I wanted to draw a picture, because I think there is a little confusion and we need to clear it up. The United States regulates radioactive waste, and this is a 16 or 8 foot long tube that I've drawn way too fat relative to its length, so we're going to do a little engineering thing and say that's a lot longer. But this is actually about how wide it is, about a finger wide, and inside this metal tube are little pellets made of uranium cooked into a ceramic form. And that is a fuel rod. And a fuel rod is pure uranium for our light water reactors today when it goes in. But while it's inside a reactor, millions of times more radioactivity are formed, because when an atom splits, it doesn't disappear. The fragments are there. And those fragments are the fission products, which are cesium, strontium, iodine, a whole alphabet soup of highly reactive elements that are fizzing off, some in microseconds, some in minutes, some in hours, some in days. And in fact, if you turn off one of the reactors here in New York State and let 30 days go by, you will cut in half the amount of radioactivity inside that reactor core. I'm not talking about the waste on the site, just inside the core. How many public health threats can you cut in half in 30 days? I ask you, why is Homeland Security doing anything else but replacing light bulbs so that we could do that? Enormous potential to increase the quote-unquote safety. It's still not safe, but half as many people would die of latent cancer if you blew it up. So half, hello, that's enormous. But if this thing leaks, which it does, you start getting particles of radioactive stuff, and everything else besides a fuel rod, big pile of stuff, which has gloves, yes it does, and it has booties, yes it does, but it also has the entire reactor dome and the reactor pressure vessel and all the pipes and all the other concrete that are so radioactive they can also kill you. This entire group is called low level. Okay? So when Arnie was talking about citing the dump I helped fight, that one was really easy to stop in Connecticut, like that. But where's that waste going to go, all this so-called low-level waste from Connecticut? It's going to, excuse me, I live in the South, I can say this, the closest thing we have to a third world country in the United States, which is South Carolina. It has closed the dump in South Carolina to everywhere else in the United States except for Connecticut, New Jersey, and South Carolina currently in the last year. So that dump that was so easy to fight is doing effectively what Arnie's suggesting, because having been to the Barnwell area in South Carolina, I can tell you I have never, ever, even having lived in Washington, D.C. for 8 years, felt so white. It is one of the blackest areas I have ever been in. I've never been to Africa, okay? But the area around Barnwell is certainly a case of an environmental justice issue. So.
Where's the mic?
I know, but I got one more. All right, this is a pie chart. It could be the Earth or the Sun, but it's a pie chart. And this is radioactivity, not volume. Okay, so this is, I can't spell, total. And this is USA. Okay, so believe me, I can't even draw a pie chart here. Okay, believe me, put a center point, okay. That's 5%, let's call that, pretend like that's 5%. This is 95%, okay? This is the total radioactivity. The pie chart is the total radioactivity of all the waste we've generated in the nuclear age in the United States. And these numbers are from 1992, which means that these percentages are even higher, that 95% of the radioactivity comes from nuclear power in these fuel rods from commercial reactors. Now in Europe, they like to move their fuel rods around. The United States, they're, for the most part, over 90% of it is sitting at the reactor that made it. So there's enormous source term sitting at the reactors today. So I'm not going to be focusing on that, but I really want people to understand, when we talk about Yucca Mountain, they're talking about 95%, the mother load of radioactivity. Those fuel rods are teeny tiny. I don't think I could draw a line fine enough in terms of their volume. But in terms of the actual issue of causing birth defects, causing cancers, causing a whole array of damages to our society and our planet, human genome, non-human genome, these fuel rods are what we're talking about. All right. Thank you. I had to get that off my chest. Now
Mary
I'll put this.
works at NEARS.
I'm going to do it.
Oh, I wasn't sure.
I'm going to do it. Well, I don't know what to clip it to. Help.
How about your thing?
Oh, it slipped.
Yeah?
All right.
Okay.
Technical moment.
Okay.
My name is Mary Olson. I work for Nuclear Information and Resource Service, which is a national organization, but we're teeny tiny. We have a very small staff. We're based in Tacoma Park, Maryland now, cheaper rent. We were founded 30 years ago, almost 1 year ago, by people who were fighting nuclear power plants in their home communities and felt that they needed a national office to support the local fights. And once the building of nuclear power plants stopped, which we have to celebrate, it's been 35 years since a reactor was ordered that was not subsequently canceled. So when we heard Arnie talk about new reactors, this is like, stop the music. This hasn't happened in a long time, folks. I mean, if you're a baker and you don't bake bread for 30 years, you can't really call yourself a baker. So they talk about it being an industry. This is like a relic that's trying to revive itself. They're calling it a renaissance. We're calling it a relapse. And just to let you know, there are currently 26 reactor proposals at the NRC as actual license applications. I don't have visuals with me, so we're just going to try this your direction. New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas.
Alabama?
Yeah, I got Alabama in there. So you've got a solid mass from Maryland across the South. Whether you call Texas the South or not, you got to talk to the people in Texas. I'm not going to claim them. Maybe it's the Republic. They got 8 proposals in Texas. We have outside of in the Southeast, we have 15. And the only other states besides New York and Pennsylvania are Michigan and Missouri. So those are the states where new proposals are fomenting. And you know, hearing this story of 3-Mile Island, I cry and I can't understand how or why they would dare try and put a new reactor in Pennsylvania, you know? And I hope that we all reach out to people we know in Pennsylvania and really support them, because that's heartbreaking. And Michigan too. It's right at the Fermi site that they want to add a new reactor, actually 2 new reactors. So this is incredible stuff that's going on, and I need to now contextualize it a little bit. I happen to be very pro-nuclear. Sorry? What, new reactor in New York? Oswego.
Yeah, there's already 3 in the same location. They want to put a 4th.
And the owner?
Constellation Nuclear. Yeah.
Same one as we're fighting in Maryland. The ownerships have shifted so much recently that I don't dare trust my own memory when I'm not out of the South. And I mentioned that we're national, 1 office in Tacoma Park, the other office is in North Carolina, and that's where I'm based as a regional staff member. But the first round of reactors, you know, it was not a resounding success. And it was not just 3-Mile Island or Chernobyl or all of my wonderful aunts and uncles who were out there getting arrested at Seabrook. That was not what stopped them in their tracks completely. It was the financial vice presidents who looked at the picture and said, this is not a way to make money. Warren Buffett would have been right back then too. They figured it out. This is not a way to make money. And in fact, there will not be a new reactor built in this country without, I understand the difference between nationalization and socialization, but the problem is that it's not only federal money, it is also state money, and it is also local money. And I'm going to sort of riff through that. But I want to tell you that the first round had over 200 reactors on the books and on the table at the time that the last one was ordered that was not subsequently canceled. There were 98 official cancellations of nuclear power plants, and a whole lot of retirement funds went down. What we're seeing today happened during the 70s and 80s in the nuclear investments. They never paid back their debts. They just walked. And then they sold the reactors for pennies on the dollar. So that's part of the past of nuclear power, and we have to remember it, because the other thing that happened was that they got the customers to pay for power plants that never came online. Billions of dollars of power plants that never came online. And there was a large consumer movement, the PERGs, and those guys really got their claws in by getting consumer protection laws passed in the 1980s that prevented that kind of ripoff of having to pay for something that never actually produced any power for the public. Unfortunately, we are seeing those laws that were passed in the 80s repealed. Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia have all repealed those laws and are actually enabling a collaboration between the Public Service Commission, Public Utility Commission, and the utilities down there in the regulated markets, and we as hostages are going to have to pay for this new generation at the state level. And then worse yet, the municipal utilities are being told they have to buy in, and there's certain forms of guns being put to certain heads. And so it's the same sort of bandit behavior coming back. But how and why is this being supported? Now, I saw a little hand up and I got interrupted on my thought that I wanted to say that I'm really very pro-nuclear. The only difference between me and Duke and Progress and Southern Company and Constellation is that I like my reactor 93 million miles away. And the gentleman who asked about baseload has already left. But anybody who thinks that solar is not baseload lives in a flat world. They don't understand that the sun does shine 24/7 for how many millions and billions of years? Hello. It is the turning of the earth that makes it not baseload in our little thinking. But if we could simply make the cognitive leap to the fact that baseload energy, meaning the 24/7 supply, is supply, not generation. If you can supply it, who the hell cares when you made it, right? So the whole issue of storing energy, delivering energy, all that stuff gets very complex and interesting and exciting and fun, and the young people I work with are all over it. And all I can tell you is baseload is part of the bandit behavior that these large corporations are pulling over our sheep's eyes, okay? So if you want to ask me questions about baseload, we'll come back to it in what we have as a remnant of time. But I want to quickly go to the fact that the Southeast is really an energy plantation at this point. We have a lot of coal, we have mountaintop removal, we have, and coal, by the way, you know, is basically solar power. It's just the ancient biomass that's been stored, and our problem is that we're releasing it all so fast and releasing it at all. But we also have, as I told you already, 22 of the 26 new reactor proposals, and 15 of them in the southeastern states close to the mountaintop removal areas. And happily, the activists are realizing it's all dirty energy, and it's all the same corporations. Every single one that has nukes has coal. And we're being told, oh, if you don't like nuclear energy, that means you support coal. Oh, you don't like coal? Come on, I got a great answer for you. You're going to love nuclear energy. And it's this false tautology that the only choices that we have because of this mystical concept of baseload are either coal or nukes. And it's just the fact that they have a whole lot more in common than they actually appear to. And one of the ways in which nuclear is being sold is as a solution to the climate crisis. And I'm not going to give the whole climate crisis talk, but I want to give you a few benchmark numbers because it's important to understand that nuclear can't do it. Even if I set aside all of my biological background, all my concern about babies and cancer and all those things, equity issues, democracy, whatever you want to call it all, set it all aside. In order to get 1/7 of a solution for the climate crisis on the projections that are now outdated already, but the previous projections, 1/7 of the solution would require 1,070 new reactors to be built over a 40-year period, which works out to about 25 reactors a year. In 2007, there were 4 reactors built, not to completion, but the major components for them, what's called the reactor pressure vessel. 4 was the global output. 4. Now they claim they can double that to 8. And okay, you can push it around a little bit, but this is a forge in Japan is the only one that can do the large ones that are being ordered today. They used to make samurai swords. We're talking a single pour for an enormous steel thing. They made samurai swords. They transmuted that technology and skill into cannon during the Second World War, and then they transmuted that cannon expertise into reactor pressure vessels. So it's not a given that we can just turn around and suddenly go from 4 to 25 reactors a year. It's not a given. And in any case, at $10 billion a piece, we heard the $6,000 a kilowatt. I'm not going to try and justify my numbers with Arnie's, but they come out to roughly the same ballpark. And you're talking about $10,700 billion to produce a 1/7 solution to the quote problem. Now, I don't want to tell you the climate crisis isn't real. I don't want to be sounding like that at all. Of course. It is totally, completely, I believe, the top priority. We all must understand that we have to put aside some of our other pet projects and really pay attention to this. But the difficult thing is that we must not waste our resources on something that will not deliver. And so again, to provide a yardstick, the fastest, the simplest, and most cost-effective way to cut greenhouse gases is to reduce the amount of energy we use. And there's two types of ways to do that. Dick Cheney talked about conservation as a personal virtue. Yeah, you turn out the lights when you leave the room. It's behaviorally based. Most conservation is in the technical definition. Efficiency, on the other hand, is what kind of light bulb do you have? If you have an incandescent light bulb, you can cut that down to 1/5 with a compact fluorescent and 1/10 with a LED. So we can deliver light bulbs. We can deliver insulation. We can deliver weatherization. We can do that socially, and we can start cutting our energy consumption way down. It is 12 to 16 times more cost effective than building a nuclear power plant. We already heard that wind, even with the intermittence, is in sort of the same ballpark, you know, as building new nukes, and so is retail PV panels, calling in the phone book and getting full price PV panels are about the same price as building new nukes. Now, I'm not saying that's the answer. I actually think the concentrating solar approach is probably the first step we have to go to, because we have corporations. I don't like them, but they want to control everything, so let them control everything with solar. So now, do I have a couple minutes left?
A couple minutes.
Okay. So now I want to go to the part about the heat issues. Arnie mentioned them. I just want to pull that little piece out and hold it up, because it is really, really important that people understand this. Concentrating solar uses steam technology to generate power. Steam technology goes back to the 1700s. It was James Watt. He figured out how to do the piston and have the steam do work. You know, the pressure of the steam actually pushed that piston. That was for locomotion and for doing work. Later, it got where you did the work and you turned a generator, and the generator makes electric power. Now, a coal plant, you burn the coal. Arnie likes to say you burn uranium. You don't. You split atoms. You release a massive amount of heat in the splitting of the atom. You use that heat in both a coal plant and a nuclear plant to boil water. And the boiling of the water produces steam, and it's basically James Watt, you know, 400 years later, 300 years later. Same thing, using that steam to turn a turbine. Turbine turns a generator, you get electric power. If you watch your tea kettle, it never boils, right? Well, it does. But if you watch it and really pay attention to it, you'll notice that you get hot water a whole lot quicker than you get steam, right? You use, it turns out, 2/3 of your fuel, whether it be a gas stove or a wood fire or an electric stove. You use 2/3 of your fuel between when you have hot water and when you have steam. And the sad and simple truth of this is that our power plants that rely on steam, that generate waste we can't live with, whether that waste be carbon dioxide, or whether that waste be mercury, or whether that waste be irradiated fuel rods and radiation, 2/3 of the waste is generated simply to get water from hot to steam, which means that 2/3 of the climate crisis never made a single electron of electricity, and 2/3 of our irradiated fuel pie over there never delivered a single light bulb turning on or a refrigerator cooling. And this is such a crime that nobody in the industry can even really look at you with a straight face and explain it to you. They'll say, yeah, we're 33% efficient. So if nuclear and coal are 33% efficient, why the hell can't we do end user efficiency as our mechanism for dealing with this problem and get these kind of plants offline? Now, I was taken to task. My friend David Freeman totally ripped me up to shreds because he said, Mary, it's not steam that's the problem, it's how you make the steam. If you concentrate sunlight and you heat oil and you use your hot oil to make steam, it's okay. You don't have a waste you can't live with. This was after the thing was printed, so I couldn't change the title of our session. But if you're making steam in a way that doesn't poison you, it might be okay. And the last thing I'm just going to add is that those concentrating thermal plants are borrowing from the nuclear world because they're running their oil after they make the steam through salt. And the salt is getting so hot that they can use the heat in the salt at night to continue generating power at the same plant. And so lo and behold, on a spinning planet, we are getting back to the fact that the sun is baseload energy. And we can do that. And we can use the steam cycle without generating waste we don't like. And yes, we have to do it in places like Florida and Arizona, and you probably can't do it here in New York. But you darn well could make sure that if tax money is spent, that it's spent on something like that.